Good afternoon and warmly welcome to today's webinar, Macroeconomic Effects of Weak Labor Market Power. My name is Daniel Lind and I work as a research director at the Trade Union Finance Productivity Commission in Sweden. Our guest today is Anna Stansbury. She's an assistant professor in economics at MIT in Boston. And our research is focused on power and institutions on the labor market. With us today is also Elinor Odeberg, who is the chief economist at the trade union-related think tank in Stockholm, Sweden. Elinor will join us in the conversation after Anna's presentation. The setup today is that we have 60 minutes at our disposal, and Anna will give a presentation for 30 minutes or so. And after that, we open up for short and sharp questions and state them in the chat, and I will bring them up later on. Having said all this, we are very happy that you are here, Anna, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. Great. And please let me know if this isn't working. Fantastic. Well, I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you so much for hosting me, Daniel, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm looking forward to presenting some of this work on worker power and then the discussion that we're going to have, which I know will be very interesting. As Daniel mentioned, my work focuses on these broad themes of power and institutions in labor markets. I'm a labor economist by training. And the topic I wanted to talk about today in conversation with Daniel was about macroeconomic effects of declining worker power. But let me start by zooming out and framing the conversation in terms of what I see as the toxic combination that afflicts most industrialized economies today and has done for many decades, which is low productivity growth, low GDP growth, and rising income inequality at the same time. And you can see that very starkly illustrated here on this graph, which takes a range of industrialized economies. It's essentially North America, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, and shows the average annual growth rate in real GDP per capita on the x-axis and the change in the top 1% income share, so a measure of top-end income inequality, on the y-axis. And you can see that between 1950 and 1980, all of these countries had high GDP growth rates and declining top-end income inequality, whereas when we move to the more recent 4 to 5 decades, you see that all of these countries had much lower GDP growth rates as well as rising top-end income inequality. The degree of that transition has been different. You can see the US has seen a particularly stark change in the pattern of income inequality, but this is a pattern, this toxic combination that afflicts all industrialized economies similarly. And why do I call this a toxic combination? Because the combination of slow economic growth and rising inequality, growing more slowly and at the same time becoming more unevenly distributed, which combine to mean that the incomes of low and middle income workers, the majority of people, are growing much more slowly than they used to and much more slowly than they otherwise might if either of those two conditions wasn't present. And I apologize in advance for my terrible clip art illustrations, but I'm fighting against the age of beautiful AI-generated illustrations, and they're showing my generation here. So this toxic combination, my work mostly focuses on the US. I have some work on the UK and some on Norway as well, but the work I'm going to present today is on the US. This toxic combination has been particularly stark in the US, and one other framing graph I want to show to illustrate this is this picture from Saez and Zuckman's work, which shows average annual real income growth rates across the income distribution. So you see the x-axis is from the 5th to the 100th percentile of the income distribution. So what it's showing you here is that the blue line shows that for basically everyone in the entirety of the US income distribution, there was real income growth of 2% per year between 1946 and 1980. And in fact, for the very top of the income distribution, there was slower real income growth. So that's inequality was declining, but most people were seeing high income growth. In the 1980 to 2018 period, you can see both that toxic combination present. First, the average growth line has fallen to 1.4%. That's the fall in real GDP growth per capita. But also, the way this line is moving is much more unevenly distributed. You're seeing the very top see massive increases in their income, even as you're seeing most of the rest of the distribution see relatively slow growth and indeed unequal growth. So my work focuses a lot on trying to understand the role of power and institutions in the labor market in these trends. And I'm going to present two pieces of work today that illuminate different pieces of this, and we can talk more about other aspects as well in the discussion. I'll very briefly present some work I've done on the link between productivity and pay. And then I'll focus most of my remarks on declining worker power and its macroeconomic effects in the US. So let's start with this question of productivity and pay. As I've shown you before, but to show you a different way, productivity and pay essentially diverged in the US since the 1970s or 80s. And I'm sure many of you have seen versions of this graph, which has been very prominent in the economic discourse in many countries which have seen similar dynamics. This is showing you in black labor productivity since 1948, indexed to 100. It's showing you average compensation in red, and it's showing you compensation of typical workers. These are production and non-supervisory workers. You can think of this as roughly like median compensation, but it goes back a lot further than our median compensation data does in the US. So what you see is that in that period until about 1975, 1980, you're seeing fast productivity growth, and pay for typical workers is keeping pace. It's growing at the same rate. But in the period since about 1975, 1980, productivity growth has slowed and pay growth has slowed even more. So this big gap has opened up in terms of the rate of growth of productivity versus pay for typical workers. So one question that this led many people to ask is, does productivity growth actually matter for the pay of typical workers? If we care about boosting this orange line, raising the real living standards of ordinary people, does caring about productivity even matter anymore? And to illustrate why that question is important, I'm going to use a very basic metaphor that I think is actually quite useful in thinking through the dynamics, which is just a tap and a bucket. We can think about workers' wages as the level of water in the bucket. And we can think about productivity growth as filling the bucket. Turning on the tap more is increasing the rate of productivity growth, and that is going to fill the bucket more, increasing workers' wages. But there may be holes in the bucket may be leaking due to other factors, and that may be reducing the water level in the bucket. So effectively what we've seen since the 1970s is productivity has grown, but typical workers' pay has grown much more slowly. The tap has been flowing, effectively. There's been water coming out, but the water level in the bucket has barely risen. So the question is why? Is it because there's a problem in the translation from productivity growth to the pay of typical workers? Is it the case that in my silly clip art illustration again here, when productivity growth is faster, that simply accrues to the wealthy? They're putting a bowl under the tap and taking away all of the fruits of the productivity growth. Therefore, it just doesn't affect the water level in the bucket at all. It doesn't affect the pay of typical workers at all. Or is it the case that the water actually is still filling up the bucket, but there's a hole in the bucket, and so the level of water is falling because of the leak, even as it's rising because the tap is flowing? That is, maybe productivity growth still benefits average pay for workers, but other factors are acting to pull it down, even as productivity growth pushes it up. So the way we try to answer this is by asking, if productivity growth is truly acting to raise workers' pay, all else equal, then in years where there's faster productivity growth, we should see that translate, ideally 1-for-1, into faster pay growth for typical workers. On the contrary, if productivity growth doesn't matter for workers' pay, it's all accruing to the rich, then we should see that years with faster or slower productivity growth, it doesn't have anything to do with the rate of pay growth. And so we can test this with regression analysis in the paper. I'm showing you a visual illustration of this here, which is just that we take the annual change in log, that effectively the percentage change in labor productivity in black, and then the percentage change in workers' pay in red for average pay on the left, and in orange for the pay of typical workers, these production and non-supervisory workers, on the right. And we residualize both of these on unemployment, which means we're taking out any effects of the business cycle, tight labor markets, and just trying to look at the effect of productivity on pay, conditional on those business cycle effects. And what you can see here is really striking. These are on the same axes, and you can see these series are almost perfectly correlated. In years where productivity growth is 1 or 2 percentage points higher, pay growth is also 1 or 2 percentage points higher. The spikes almost exactly track each other, and they're basically the same size. So what this is telling us, and what we can confirm with our regression analysis, is that productivity growth is very tightly linked to workers' pay, even for these typical workers. In years where productivity growth is higher, pay growth is much higher. And that tells us that productivity growth still does matter. Productivity growth has been boosting typical workers' pay, but other factors have been acting to pull it down at the same time. That is, the problem is a leak in the bucket, not a stoppage in the tap. And this set of insights is what led me in part to pursue some of the work on worker power, because the question then becomes, very importantly, what are these other factors? One of the possibilities, of course, is that declining worker power was reducing the counterfactual level of workers' pay, even as productivity growth was boosting it, that the hole in the bucket was worker power. And that takes me on to the second set of analyses that I want to talk about today and spend most of the time on, which is this work on declining worker power. And I'm going to present conclusions from a paper with Larry Summers. The prior work was also work with Larry Summers. Again, taking this kind of long view of the US economy since the 1970s or 1980s. So we're taking that inflection point where the toxic combination began and asking, to what extent is what we've seen since that inflection point caused by declining worker power? And specifically, there are a few big macro trends since 1980 in the US that have been notable at the same time. I already mentioned rising inequality, and that actually comes in two flavors. We've got rising capital labor inequality, so a decline in the labor share of income, and we've also got rising income inequality among workers within labor. But we've also got other trends I haven't talked about yet. A big sustained increase in corporate profitability, measured in various different ways, and a sustained decline in the average unemployment rate alongside low and stable inflation, so suggesting that the natural or the non-inflation accelerating unemployment rate has gone down quite substantially over the period as well. And the confluence of these trends has been very stark and has led to a lot of research trying to understand all of them together or some of them in isolation. And essentially the potential drivers in this research have fallen into four buckets. Number one, globalization. Number two, technological change. Number three, rising corporate power. That could be monopoly power or monopsony power. And number four, falling worker power. And in this paper, we make the case that the best explanation, the most consistent explanation with the theory and the data for all these trends is a sustained and substantial fall in worker power in the US. So since we're going to be talking about power, I want to kind of clarify what I mean by three different kinds of power. Monopoly power, as we'll all be familiar with, is power in the product market. So I'm going to define this as firms charging a price above their marginal cost, meaning that they earn rents or above normal profits in the product market. And this can come from brand power, market concentration, or being one of the few large firms in a market, barriers to entry, anti-competition practices or policies. I'm going to define monopsony power as power in the labor market where firms pay a wage below the marginal product of labor, and so they earn rents from labor. This can come from, again, market concentration, if the firm being a large employer in its labor market. It can come from labor market frictions. It's just hard to find other jobs, and so people are kind of tied to their employer. And it can come also, again, from explicit barriers to competition in the labor market, like non-compete agreements. And third, worker power. And I'm defining worker power as distinct from monopoly power, so I want us to understand why that is. I'm calling worker power workers' ability to increase their pay above the level that would otherwise prevail based on the market conditions, monopoly and monopoly power conditions. That is, worker power is the ability for workers to lay claim to some of the rents created in product markets by monopoly power, and or their ability to counteract firms' monopoly power. So worker power can play a role in tandem with either of these other two types of power. And we can think of worker power as coming from unions, most obviously, or the union threat effect, if you're not in a union, but the firm knows you might form a union, as well as from things like efficiency wages and other sources of informal, implicit or explicit bargaining power within firms. So in theory, declining worker power can explain our three macro trends. And let me just talk through briefly why that is. I think most obviously, declining worker power can explain rising inequality. It can explain a falling labor share of income because part of what worker power is doing in this framework is explicitly redistributing some of those rents from capital, from firm owners to labor, but also because it's redistributing within labor to the extent that worker power tends to be more concentrated in the US in middle and lower, tended to be in middle and lower income workers, especially unionization. Perhaps less intuitively, declining worker power can also explain rising profitability in theory. And that's because it's simply the other side of the coin of the falling labor share in some sense. If part of the role of worker power is to redistribute from capital to labor, then if worker power falls, the returns to capital will go up, even as the returns to labor, the wage will go down. And profitability will then rise if product markets and capital markets are not fully competitive. And so those extra returns aren't fully competed away. And thirdly, declining worker power can explain this falling NERU, this falling unemployment rate, even with stable inflation in theory. And that's because we have two very prominent and sort of well-supported theoretical reasons for believing that strong worker power and strong unions in particular may be associated with high unemployment or high inflation in a low unemployment world, which would be, number one, that raising the cost of labor reduces firms' incentives to employ workers and therefore increases the natural rate of unemployment. And number two, perhaps a bit more nuanced, rising worker power can incentivize wait unemployment, which is where workers are incentivized to spend longer searching between jobs in order to get one of the good jobs as opposed to one of the bad, lower paid jobs. And that can also increase the average level of unemployment, the non-inflationary level of unemployment. So in theory, we see that this declining worker power hypothesis is consistent with these macro trends. But of course, that doesn't help us unless it's also consistent with the data. So what we want to do next in this paper is ask, well, empirically, is the decline in worker power meaningful in the US? Can we quantify it? And is it plausibly big enough to explain these dramatic trends that we've seen? So let me start by just describing the evidence that we have for a decline in worker power. And I'll give 5 pieces of evidence on this slide. The first is, again, most obviously, union decline. So you see the figure on the bottom left, which shows the unionization rate in the private sector in the US since the early 1970s. You can see that the union membership rate then was about 25%. In fact, if you go back even further to the mid-1950s, it was about 35%. And it just steadily declines on this ski slope to around 6% by the 2020s. Another thing to note from this slide is that in the US, the union membership rate and the union coverage rate are basically identical. There's no extension of union bargains or contracts beyond those who are union members on the whole. The firms that are covered are usually firms where everyone's a member. And so the union coverage rate declined completely in tandem with that. Only 6% of private sector workers by the 2020s were covered by a union contract. But also, which is less well known than this fact, there was a decline not only in union membership, but a decline in the union wage premium. So the union wage premium is the amount that unionized workers are paid more relative to otherwise similar non-unionized workers. So you take a worker of the same education level, age, sex, region, and industry of employment, and ask how much more are they paid if they're a unionized worker versus non. That figure is between 15, 20, 25%, depending exactly how and when you measure it. But that number has also fallen over the last years. So it looks like unions cover fewer people, but also they're less powerful for the people that they cover. The wage effect that they can garner is smaller than it used to be. Second, we have the decline in the large firm wage premium. And I'm showing you this in the second figure on the slide. The large firm wage premium is the premium that a worker is paid if they're working in a large firm relative to a small firm. And that's been a very consistent fact across economies for a long time, that workers that are in large firms tend to be paid more than workers that are the same age, sex, education level, industry, region, but work in a small firm. That large firm wage premium, as you can see here in the early 1990s, was about 20% for a very large firm versus a very small firm. But it has also declined substantially, particularly for non-college educated workers. In fact, it's almost been eroded completely for non-college educated workers. Why do we call that the effect of a decline in worker power? We think it's because part of the large firm wage premium likely reflected bargaining power. It might have reflected the union threat effect. It's often more of a threat for a large firm to become unionized than a small firm, more concerning, more of a target for organizing. But also it can reflect other sources of power. If you are a worker that is able to affect the production process, shut down the production line, throw a spanner in the works, metaphorically or literally, in a large firm, that power, the cost of exerting that power is much greater. But that power may have diminished also over time, as reflected in this declining large firm wage premium. And third, we see a decline in the variance of industry wage differentials. So just as I've talked about the union wage premium and the large firm wage premium, you can also think about an industry wage premium. So take, again, two workers that otherwise look the same, they have the same education, age, sex, region, and ask one worker who's in manufacturing is paid maybe 20% more than an otherwise identical worker who's in retail. And it's been very consistent, again, across time and across economies, that there are these big industry wage differentials. What is less well known is that these industry wage differentials have shrunk, they've narrowed. So the gap between a manufacturing worker and a retail worker has actually shrunk quite a lot over the period that we've seen. And again, we see this as reflective in part potentially of a decline in worker power. Even among non-unionized workers, you're seeing that the benefits to being in these high rent industries has fallen. I don't have a graph for this one, but we also see a weakening relationship between productivity and pay, or concentration and wage premia. So what that means is when you're in a firm that is more productive or an industry that is more productive, are you paid more as a worker? That's an illustration that you have the power, in some sense, to share in the successes of the firm or industry, in the product market rents. That relationship in the US has substantially weakened over the last 5 decades. The ability to share in those product market rents has fallen. And finally, we see this rise of domestic outsourcing. So you're seeing, for example, security guards and janitors no longer being employed by a large profitable firm like a Goldman Sachs or an Apple, and instead being employed by a subcontractor firm that is very low profit. And that is associated with a decline in wages as well. So we have a lot of reasons to believe that worker power has declined, quite substantially. And the question then becomes, can we quantify it? So to do that, we take the concepts that I just talked about and try and use them to estimate what we call labor rents. Labor rents, I'm referring to here as the amount that workers earn, which is over and above what they would earn in the absence of worker power. So if you take the market with its current market structure, its current degree of monopoly and monopsony power, and you took worker power to zero, what would be the difference in what workers earned? That's the concept of labor rents. And we try and operationalize this with the three concepts I just talked about on the last slide. Number one is going to be union rents. So we're going to take the union wage premium and give that to all the workers that are unionized. And that gives us a numerical, quantifiable estimate of union rents, the amount that workers are paid more because they are union members. And we can do the same for these other two concepts I just talked about, firm size rents and industry rents. So we take the amount that workers are paid more because they're in a large firm or because they're in a well-paid industry, the large firm wage premium and the industry wage premium, and we assign those additional pay premia to all the workers that are in the large firms, to all the workers that are in the high pay industries. And we can again aggregate that up and quantify what is the total amount of pay in the economy that comes from these large firm rents or these industry rents. So what I'm showing you here is the result of that quantification exercise. This is showing our estimate of labor rents as a share of total value added in the non-financial corporate sector in the US. And it's showing you that there's been a steep decline in this measure over time. You're seeing roughly halving from about, if you take it as a share of net value added, about 11% of net value added in the 1980s, falling to about 6% of net value added by the 2015-2016 period. So this is a meaningful number. This is 5-6% of net value added in the whole economy, in the non-financial corporate sector. At least part of the whole economy is a large number. And that number actually is big enough to explain the entire decline in the labor share of income in the US. So here, that red line I'm showing you is the same as the line I just showed you in the previous slide. That's our labor rent share as a measure of value added. But I'm just superimposing behind it now the blue line, which is the labor share. That's just take value added, what share of value added goes to labor, the remainder of that goes to capital. And you're seeing that the magnitude of the decline from 1982 to 2016 was basically identical. Our labor rent share decline is big enough to explain the entirety of the decline in the aggregate US labor share of income. So that's interesting because it tells us that this worker power story fits in theory with the decline of the labor share and is big enough in practice to explain the magnitude of the decline in the labor share. The next question empirically is, does it also fit with some of the, the less aggregate level of evidence? And one of the ways we can break that down is to look at the industry level. So this is now showing you a calculation across NAICS 3-digit industries. There's about 50 of these industry categories. And we're calculating at the level of each of these industries now the exact same thing as we did for the whole economy, which is for each industry, we calculate the labor rent share, which is our measure of labor power and how much it's declined. And we compare that to just the labor share in that industry, which is just the measure from the national accounts of what share of value added in that industry goes to labor versus capital, and how much they've changed from the 80s to the 2010s. And you can see here this very, very steep and very, very strong correlation negative pattern. Each bubble is an industry, and the size of the bubble is the size of the industry. So you're seeing that industries with bigger declines in our measure of labor power, the labor rent share, saw bigger declines in their labor share of value added. Again, strongly indicative that this labor rent share, this measure of worker power, is picking up something real that is leading to the decline in the labor share of income. And you can also do the same thing, by the way, if you're not convinced by our labor rent share measure. If you want to just look at the unionization rate, forget all of the complicated union wage premia, industry wage premia, firm size wage premia, the pattern is not as tight, but it's still there. The industries with bigger declines in their unionization rate also saw bigger declines in their labor share. I'm not going to have time to show you other of the evidence that we have on this topic today, but we have also some evidence on the state level that again makes it look very consistent that this decline in worker power is very correlated with this decline in the labor share of income. We can also do the same for profitability, which again I won't show you today, showing that our measure of worker power is very correlated with these rises in aggregate profitability that we're seeing in the economy. So I've talked a lot about the worker power portion of this, and it's how we think about its macroeconomic implications. But of course, the way I motivated this section of my remarks was thinking about, well, there are four different big things that have changed in the last 4 or 5 decades that could be explaining these trends: globalization, technological change, corporate power, and worker power. So in terms of globalization, can it actually explain these trends as well as worker power can? We argue no. It can explain the falling labor share in theory, because globalization reduces effectively worker power in rich countries because of competition from low-wage labor elsewhere. It's very difficult to see that globalization can explain rising corporate profitability because it increases competition rather than decreasing it. There's no reason in theory why globalization could explain the falling unemployment pattern. It's not particularly consistent with the industry level evidence. The industries that saw bigger falls in their labor share are diametrically opposed to the industries that saw bigger increases in import competition. So it just really wasn't the same industries. There is direct evidence, of course, of the phenomenon itself. What about technological change? Again, we think the pattern is mixed. For the same reasons, technological progress can explain the falling labor share, and there's direct evidence of it happening. But it's not consistent with a falling natural rate of unemployment, particularly. There's no reason for that. It doesn't seem to be able to explain rising corporate profitability. And it doesn't seem particularly consistent with the industry level evidence. The industries that have been the most subject to technological change and automation do not seem to be the industries where we've seen big declines in the labor share, which are certain manufacturing industries, not the most technical manufacturing industries, construction, and transportation. What about monopoly power? Well, this one can do more of the theoretical explanations because it can explain rising corporate profitability. It still can't explain the declining natural rate of unemployment. In fact, if anything, theory would suggest the opposite. Rising monopoly power should raise the natural rate of unemployment. It doesn't seem very consistent with the industry level evidence. We show in the paper that the industries that see rising concentration are not really the industries that see declining labor shares. And there's actually not that much direct evidence that monopoly power itself has risen, as opposed to redistribution from capital to labor, from labor to capital has happened, which could be consistent with falling worker power. Whereas we think that this falling worker power hypothesis is consistent in theory with all of these three big trends. It's the most consistent with the industry level evidence, and there's the most direct evidence that the phenomenon has actually been happening. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of those two pieces of research that I think are interestingly related, and let me just give 3 implications of those, and then I look forward to the discussion. The first implication: power matters, not just secular trends like automation and globalization. In fact, I think this research and other research in this vein suggests that the decline in worker power is one of the most important structural changes to have taken place in the US economy in recent decades. And also that institutions like worker power mediate how these bigger structural forces, like globalization and technological change, affect ordinary people. Number 2, if declining worker power is the problem and not rising corporate power, then tackling corporate power by trying to get to more perfect, more competitive markets is not likely to be enough. And part of the question, and I think this might be interesting for the discussion, is a question of which world we think we live in. What is the underlying structure of a modern economy? Is it a small is beautiful world, where it is possible in theory to make markets perfectly competitive? We can tackle monopoly power and monopoly power by policy, and as markets get closer to perfect competition, wages rise and inequality is reduced. Or do we live in what I'm calling a Galbraithian world, where monopsony and monopoly power is inevitable based on market structure, and so strong unions are necessary to provide countervailing power and redistribute those monopoly rents to workers, not just capitalists? And finally, and this is why I presented this work on productivity and pay at the beginning, productivity growth is just as important as inequality in terms of raising the level of ordinary workers' pay. High productivity growth still matters for typical workers, even though there's been this yawning increase in inequality. And therefore, we shouldn't forget that elephant in the room. So I just have all of those takeaways on a slide here, but I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, for a very clear presentation. And I also welcome Eleanor. But let me start with the first question, Anna. This is not the Econ 101 labor market you're discussing here with institutions and labor market power. So how come you became interested in this topic?
Yeah, great question. I think I'd always been interested in these questions about inequality. The labor share of income was an interest of mine even before my PhD. And it was during my PhD that I became interested in these imperfect labor market explanations. And I think that was in part by reading a lot of economic history and starting to understand the role of, at first, the role of the labor movement and the union movement in massive changes in inequality, both through the policy and legislative lens, but also through exerting power in labor markets in the first half of the 20th century in the US and a lot of Western Europe. That got me onto the question of unions. And then, of course, once you're interested in unions, then you've got to be interested in how do they actually affect labor markets. And the effect of a union in a labor market is very different if you're in an Econ 101 world, where it's inefficient, it's moving employment away from the efficient level, it's raising wages for insiders, but it's casting out outsiders. Versus if you're in an imperfectly competitive labor market, the effects are much more nuanced. It depends on the kind of imperfect competition, but it actually can be efficient. It can even raise employment in some contexts. And so that question then made me think, well, it's very important to understand what the nature of labor markets are. I started reading about monopsony and imperfect competition, and then here we are today.
There you are today. Just to follow up on that, this kind of research has also increased in importance over the last decade or two.
Yeah.
Why do you think this increase has happened?
I think it's an interesting combination of things. I've been in the profession for a decade, so I speak partly to my own experience, but also to kind of what I understand what was happening before that from the literature and from colleagues. I think it was a combination of two things. One is history happening in some sense. The massive rise in inequality that we saw, I think first became very prominent and obvious, in the early 2000s. And then with the Great Recession and the financial crisis globally, I think became a topic that was of utmost paramount importance to people writ large and also then to the economics profession. And so understanding that became more important. And then questions of distribution naturally will lead to these kinds of questions.
Yeah.
I also think the other parallel development is the empirical, whatever you want to call it, revolution in economics research in the last decades that has led to questioning of some of these basic theories. So sort of parallel to the points I was making about my own thinking about unions and then thinking about labor markets, I think a lot of the work that was done on minimum wages in particular, finding that minimum wages had small employment effects and that this was very true very consistently across contexts in the 1990s and into the 2000s, led to an interest in the broader economics profession in the theoretical study of the structure of labor markets and a kind of reevaluation of the perfect competition model there. And I think those two channels, the empirical revolution making us question how we're thinking about labor markets, plus history making us realize this is really important, like the events of the world, I think that's probably what my take on what happened.
Oh, that's mine too, I think. Eleanor, well, what are your first thoughts about Anna's presentation?
Well, first of all, it's really interesting to listen to you. We've been looking forward to this since our conference a few months back. There were a few things that I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a bit more about. First of all, I think it's really interesting that you're really separating worker power and monopoly power or monopsony power, that you're not, intertwining these two. And I was wondering also, because my sense is that, now we have a growing interest in monopsony power, and we're finally seeing that, okay, these monopoly markets that we're seeing on product markets, we have the same sort of power dynamics on the labor market. But you're basically saying that, it's not enough to just have more employers or have more opportunities for workers. You also have to have them unionized, and you're illustrating this also the large firm premium that's going down, and that was also something that I was reflecting about, because we can really see that here in Sweden, that at the large firms, that's where we're keeping up the wages, and we have a fair amount of unionization, and it's not just more competition policies wouldn't just solve the problem. In fact, the fact that they are unionized is actually something that's it's a countervailing force, sort of. But I was just wondering how is that met in the econ world, and why is it important, do you think, to distinguish these two? Because of course it's also interlinked.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most interesting topics right now in econ research. So I definitely don't have the final word on this, and I'm interested in both of your thoughts as well. I think my thinking on this right now is that some people think of monopsony power and worker power as sort of two sides of the same coin. And so increasing one naturally decreases the other. And I think the reason I push back against that way of thinking is because I see worker power as workers being able to lay claim to some of the product market rents as well, regardless of whether their company has monopsony power. So it's sort of pushing against the monopsony power in the labor market, but also playing an independent role in laying claim to product market rents. And the reason I think that matters is because you can imagine a world where firms have very little monopsony power, but lots of monopoly power, say, in product markets. They're making huge profits. They have high brand value. Maybe like Apple is an example of that. They have this brand value. They're making all these profits from it. But if the workers don't have any worker power, they're not going to lay claim to any of those profits. That's why I make that distinction. And I think the idea that perfecting markets towards getting rid of monopsony power isn't enough, I think is partly because it goes to this question of, do we think large firms are good or bad? And there's, as you said, if large firms are the firms that are keeping pay high, we know that large firms may be, quote unquote, bad in some senses if they're exerting monopoly and monopsony power. That's inefficient. Economically, as well as being bad from an inequality perspective. But we also know large firms tend to be more efficient than small firms and more productive. And so you have this trade-off where if you really want to perfect markets and make them very competitive, you don't want lots of large firms, because that's not going to lead to competitive labor markets. But that might actually mean you're choosing lower productivity and lower efficiency, which might be net worse in the long run. And so I think my kind of underlying view of how the underlying structure of the economy in the 21st century, I guess, is that large firms are going to be more efficient than small firms, number one, on the whole. And number two, that market power is a real phenomenon that is just not going to be eliminated effectively by policy. You can tackle it to some extent, of course, and you should, and there should be competition policy, and you shouldn't have overweening non-compete agreements, but it's going to be present because there are frictions in transactions and there is brand loyalty and all this stuff. And so in the presence of those two things, you're always going to have large firms with market power. And if you do, then you need countervailing power from unions.
If I can follow up, Daniel,
Yes,
because it's a really strong narrative, I feel like, at least in the political discourse here in the Nordics, that this romance even almost around small firms and small enterprises, and this monopsony argument has been also used to privatize big parts of the public sector, saying, okay, well, the employers needs to have more to choose from, more employers to choose from, and this also a very big emphasis on the supply side, that okay, if you're a worker and you're not happy about your situation, then you should exit rather than voice. You should go to another employer, and we should strengthen workers' possibilities to do so rather than vocalizing our discontent and organizing and trying to strive towards better conditions. Because what happens also with a globalized world is that then you just put in another type of labor force that's doing the same jobs but still the bad conditions, basically. So yeah, I just think it's really interesting that you're making this argument. I think it's really necessary for the econ debate.
Yeah, and I think, if I might say, I don't think I actually have other work that's on this question of monopsony power and competition and concentration and can workers choose enough between firms. I think that matters. I really do. And I think that it is directionally better for workers to have more choice and to reduce barriers to mobility. I think there seems to be very good evidence that raises wages, and it also just is better if you have more choice because of other margins, like you might prefer a different boss or be happier with the location or whatever. So I think that matters. I think my view is just very strongly that is not going to be enough if we care about these big questions. Yeah.
Can I just continue on the worker power? In Sweden, Anna, we have this kind of central wage mark, which means that the unions and the business side negotiate the wage mark for the total economy each year or 2 or 3 year periods. For us, that's also that's a way to secure the wage share because nominal wage increase will be productivity plus inflation. On average. So in that sense, we protect the wage share. But our story from the trade union side is also that if you push the wages up for all, then you also will have a productivity effect from that because it makes it more profitable for firms to change to more capital. So in that sense, we argue that also push productivity in the future, it will gain more real wage growth. Are you aware of that thinking in the models or the world you are?
Yeah, I think that is such an interesting argument. And I think in theory, it's very compelling. I don't know that from the academic economics perspective, I've seen research that kind of answers that question either way. But I think it's very possible that high wages push up aggregate productivity growth for that reason. One argument we actually make in the paper that I presented today that I didn't talk about was about the decline in investment, which is a very similar argument. So a big further trend in the US since the 1980s has been a decline in the rate of investment in capital relative to the returns on capital. And so the question has been, why has investment been so anemic? And one of the arguments we make, we aren't able to disentangle if this is empirically true, is exactly your argument, which is, well, as worker power declined, firms had less incentive to invest in capital because they had less incentive to substitute capital for labor. And so maybe this is why investment is low and productivity growth is low, at least in part. So I think there's definitely a compelling theory for it, but I haven't yet seen the kind of bulletproof way to answer it empirically.
No. But you have done research on how unions can affect productivity in individual firms.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of another story. On the local level, it can be a positive effect.
Yes, yeah. If I may talk about that research a little bit. This is work I've done in Norway with Alexander Willen, who I know gave a seminar here recently as well, and Sam Dodini. And we use the Norwegian administrative data, so it's data on all firms and all workers, to look at unions in Norwegian manufacturing. And we find that when unionization is increased in these manufacturing firms, the firms actually increase their employment, increase their wages, as you would expect, and become more productive in terms of the nominal value added per worker. So they're able to, it seems like a kind of win-win. And then we're able to kind of disentangle why. And we're not able actually to see this channel of the capital investment question. We don't know, we don't think we have any particular evidence that's what's happening. It could be. What we can see happening is that firms are substituting towards more experienced workers. And so there's some effect there where the firms are getting more productive because as they pay higher wages, they're able to recruit more skilled workers, I guess. And we also see that they're able to raise their prices. And so that could be that they're making better products. The quality of the products is improving, and that part we can't see. But it's very strong, this productivity effect. And so I think it's really very counter to the Econ 101 worldview.
Okay. Yeah. Eleanor, do you have any opinions or thoughts?
Well, another thing that I was wondering a bit about is when you look at this pay wage or productivity pay linkage and that it's falling behind in the US at least, you're looking at average compensation, right, for the average worker and then the total productivity, right? And do you think that there is some explanation in the fact that the middle class seems to be shrinking, that typical workers' jobs are shrinking, and then you have more of a growth of works in the more highly specialized workforce, and then not very productive service jobs, of still important jobs, but not very productive ones. Is that, because that'd be an explanatory.
So it could have been, and actually I rushed through this a bit. So we look in the data that I showed you today, we look at average workers, where you're right that this dynamic could be at play. We also look at production and non-supervisory workers, which are about 80% of workers, the kind of bottom 80% effectively in terms of wages. And we also, which I didn't show you, look at the median. And we also look at different percentiles in the wage distribution. And we actually find that this linkage is really strong. For the median worker, it's really strong at lower percentiles of the wage distribution. And so the explanation that you talk about could well have been what was happening, but it's not, as we find in the data. Even for these lower and middle income workers that are in the shrinking middle class, we're finding that when productivity growth is higher, their pay is higher by kind of 1 for 1. So it still really helps everyone throughout the distribution, with the exception of maybe the bottom, where their pay is more determined by the minimum wage than by productivity.
Right. And I also was wondering, when you've sort of established this, that the falling worker power is one of the strongest explanations to why this is happening, can you see, because this trend is also happening here in Sweden, but just from very much higher unionization levels.
Yeah.
What were the policies, or what were the changes in the labor market that drove this trend? So that we can learn from it to keep unionization level high.
Yeah, and I'd be very interested in the Swedish case as well and what's happening there. In the US, I think it was a combination of so there was a combination of a few things. One was explicit policy and legislative changes that took a long time to play out in the labor market, so making it harder to unionize. There was, for example, the expansion of right to work states, where it's effectively more difficult for unions to finance themselves because workers don't have to pay union membership fees, even though they're represented by a union. There's a free rider problem. So that reduces unionization. And there were various other legislative changes that basically made it harder for unions to campaign, to organize, and to bargain. And that is also happening on top of a relatively weak legal underpinning of the union movement to begin with in the US. So, for example, while it's illegal to fire a union organizer, there is no penalty effectively on firms for doing so. All the firm has to do is offer the union organizer their job back and post a little sign saying, "We're sorry." And so with the legal infrastructure was already weak. There were a series of legal changes throughout the second half of the 20th century that weakened that further. On top of that, there was a kind of decline in the norms effectively around unions. There was a big increase in hostility institutionally towards unions. It was exemplified by Reagan firing the air traffic controllers en masse in the early 1980s, sort of legitimizing abusing the legal system or getting up close to where the law breaking is by companies en masse. And those two trends were huge. Combine that with then the sort of secular trend of the decline in manufacturing employment. Manufacturing was just a base. And so if manufacturing is declining, you need lots of unionization happening elsewhere to keep the rate the same. Plus globalization, which was competing with unions. And you take those secular trends plus the policy and the norms, and that was a kind of toxic environment for the union movement.
Can I just continue on that from Daniel from Austria? He asks a question on if Bidenomics has, with the industrial policies, has improved the unionization and density rate in the US. Can you see any effect on that?
Yeah, so the Biden administration was probably the most pro-union administration in a really long time in the US in terms of both their messaging and language and in terms of things that they did or tried to do. The aggregate unionization rate has not budged. So I think the difficulty is that there have been kind of, the industrial policy in terms of favoring unionization through the industrial policy programs, that's mattered. There have also been big pushes for unionization at prominent employers like Starbucks and Amazon. But in aggregate, we're still in the same place we were before, roughly, in terms of about 6% private sector unionization. It's just very, very hard. You need a huge upswell to make a difference in that number.
Okay. Okay, then I have another question. We just have 4 minutes left or something, 5 minutes. But in a few weeks' time, I will meet Benjamin Sachs in Harvard. And he is a guy who thinks about how can we improve the collective bargaining system in the US? How can we make it more collective?
Mhm.
Do you think that road is possible, or is the union density change enough to change the weakening worker power in the US?
Yeah, great point. And I'm a big fan of Benjamin Sachs' work on these projects. I think the difficulty with the firm level bargaining system we have in the US is precisely as you're saying, that raising union density, establishment by establishment, is an incredibly difficult process. And there are huge headwinds against it, not only legally in the environment that I've described, but also it's just competitively very difficult. If you're in an environment where all of your competitors are non-union and then a firm is organized, that is a competitive disadvantage. And so the firm will rationally fight against it, and they may not be able to offer big wage increases even if they do. Because if you're in a world where there is no sectoral floor, unlike the situation in Sweden, then wages remain in competition. And so I think I'm not sure exactly what Ben Sachs is pushing for right now, but a lot of the thinking in the US right now is whether we should try and move towards a system which generates sectoral floors more similar to the systems in a lot of continental European countries, for precisely that reason, that it seems completely unfeasible to boost worker power purely by reunionizing individual firms from the starting point of 6%.
Yeah. But is there any realistic chance within a decade or two to get anywhere on that, or?
No, I don't think so. So I don't want to be so right now. No, I mean it depends who ends up in the federal government. But even under the Biden administration, I think these were ideas that were talked about, but were not advanced, were not kind of popular enough within the Democratic Party to actually be legislated. It's possible if there were further Democratic administrations that those ideas would have become popular enough to be legislated in the future. So that's possible. Obviously, right now with the federal administration, that's not something they're interested in or have shown any interest in. There is a potential for something happening at the state level. So this is where some interesting things are happening. So several states in the US have instituted sector level wage standards for specific occupations or industries, or sector level effectively bargaining groups around, for example, health and safety standards for care workers, or California's sectoral minimum wage for fast food. So you're seeing certain states starting to take steps like that. And so I think there's no chance of this happening at the federal level soon, but we might see a lot of states in a kind of laboratories of democracy sense explore these policies, and that then may make the case for the federal level, as it has done with the minimum wage, where we've seen lots of states in the US raise their minimum wage quite high, even as the federal minimum wage has remained very, very, very low and hasn't been increased in nearly 20 years.
Yeah, I read somewhere that the minimum wage in Seattle is kind of $25 or something. I don't know exactly, but a major improvement.
Yes, I don't know the exact level, but that sounds not too implausible. And the California fast food minimum wage is $20. So, yeah.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so I ask Eleanor, do you have any final question or idea or conclusion?
No, I just think it's really important your work, and also to sort of establish that the employers are setting the wage. It seems like a very apparent conclusion, but it has been this theory of the market, the invisible hand in the market is going to sort everything out, and now we're actually introducing power dynamics into the economics and mainstream economics, and I think that's really, really important to understand how we can actually raise productivity in the future. So thank you for your presentation and your work.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I absolutely agree. If I may just chip in on that, sorry, you said the invisible hand. Maybe I'll end with just a remark about, I was rereading Adam Smith recently and reminded that even Adam Smith was worried about combinations of employers. And he said, wherever there are employers, they will combine to suppress the wage. So monopsony power really was Econ 101 once upon a time.
I actually wrote an essay on that 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wonderful. No way. Look forward to reading it.
But anyway, thanks for joining us for an hour and taking your time. It was a pleasure having you here, and hopefully we meet in the future somewhere.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.